On a rain-soaked training range at Fort Benning, Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne is told she does not belong, sabotaged by the instructor sworn to judge her, and pushed toward failure before the course even begins. But what no one sees is the promise she made to her dying father, a legendary marksman from Montana. This story begins as a military trial by fire and becomes a breathtaking fight for legacy, survival, and the impossible shot.
The crosshairs settled on a shot the instructors at Camp Lejeune swore was impossible. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne pressed her cheek to the M40 stock, the wind telling her things most shooters never learn. 1,247 meters out, a steel target hid between two North Carolina pines. For 40 years, that target had gathered rust and ridicule. Behind her, Gunnery Sergeant Brock Hessler was already scrawling her failure in his notes. But Elise learned to shoot in draws twice as nasty as this, taught by a man who never missed. His memory was a debt she carried through 2 pumps and 8 months of grief. She felt him there, a steadying hand from the Montana dirt where Thomas Thorne lay. But to make the shot, she first had to survive 3 weeks of pure misery. 8 months ago, the Missoula hospital smelled of bleach, and the coming winter, Thomas Thorne was a shadow in the bed by the window, cancer having burned through him like a wildfire. At 68, his hands were still a long gunner's, steady while he fell apart. Elise held them, feeling the calluses etched by 4 decades of trigger time. "Promise me," her father rasped. She leaned in. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains stood against a cold, gray sky. Those peaks were their church, where a girl learned patience wasn't waiting, but a constant, active choice. A decision you make until it's just what you do. Anything, Dad. He met her gaze, his eyes still sharp with the focus of 1,000 lessons. "Finish it," he said. "Become the scout sniper I couldn't be." Her throat went tight. Her father was a backcountry legend in Montana. He could read the land like a book, but he never wore the uniform he'd raised her to join. "I tried," she whispered. "Twice. Iraq cost me 6 months. The stand gave me 4. The waiver. You got 1 more shot." Thomas gripped her hand, his strength a surprise. "Medboard signed off. March 2026. That's your deadline. 1 last chance." He pulled her close. "Make it count, Elise. Show them what my daughter's made of." 3 weeks on, she stood by his grave in the rain, making that promise to the cold earth. Now, at the edge of the ranges at Lejeune, that promise of fire in her gut, Elise saw the sun slice through the pines. The bus from Pendleton had left her at the gates before dawn. 23 other aspirants emerged from the dark like ghosts. She was the only one they stared at. The sergeant at check-in read her orders twice. Thorne, Elise. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Marine Division. The words tasted foreign in his mouth. Here, for the Scout Sniper Basic Course, it wasn't a question. Elise confirmed it was. He stamped her papers, avoiding her eyes, and jerked a thumb toward the squad bay. His silence was louder than any words. The barracks hallway reeked of CLP, floor wax, and the kind of fear that knew most of the Marines here would be broken. Elise found her assigned rack in a bay with 11 others, who all went quiet as she walked in. A corporal with a Hollywood face and a cocky grin watched her stow her gear. She tuned him out. A young PFC with anxious energy gave a quick nod from his rack. She nodded back. First formation was 0500. 24 Marines stood in ranks on the cracked pavement as the sun rose. Elise had picked a spot in the 2nd row, trying to be invisible, but that was a luxury she wouldn't be afforded. Gunnery Sergeant Brock Hessler prowled the formation like he was inspecting livestock for the grinder. He was big, with a face locked in permanent disapproval. Gray was creeping into his high and tight. His pale blue eyes were cold as a winter sky, sizing up each Marine like a cut of meat. He'd stop, ask a question to make them squirm, then move on. When he got to Elise, he lingered. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, her name sounding like something he'd scraped off his boot. "2nd Mardiv," he paused, checking his clipboard. 2 pumps. Iraq, Afghanistan. Another beat. Rifle expert, high shooter for your battalion. His eyes found hers. Medical waivers for 2 prior attempts at this course. Shrapnel in Iraq. Compound fracture in the stand. A smile without an ounce of warmth touched his lips. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, why are you here? Elise stared straight ahead. To become a scout sniper, gunnery sergeant. Wrong, he boomed. You're here because some REMF decided quotas matter more than combat readiness. You're here because your CO wanted to score points. You're here because the Corps thinks standards are optional. He faced the whole formation. But let me be clear. In my house, standards are everything. Quotas don't pass this course, and political statements don't last 3 weeks here. He turned back to Elise, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I'll give you a week, maybe less. He moved on, leaving Elise rigid at attention, her heart slamming against her ribs while 23 pairs of eyes sized her up all over again. The air around her shifted. The corporal's smirk was now a full-blown grin. The sandy-haired PFC looked away. No one seemed surprised. That night, in her rack, Elise pulled out the worn photo from her wallet. Her dad stared back. From 12 years ago, rifle in hand in a Montana field, wearing the smile she'd spent her life trying to earn. The bitter roots rose behind him, eternal and snow-covered. She ran her thumb over the creased edge, a talisman carried through 2 wars and endless doubt. I'm here, she whispered into the dark. Now I just gotta make it through. She flipped the photo over. Her father's neat script listed 3 promises. 1. Graduate high school. Check. 2. Serve honorably. Check. 3. Become Marine Scout sniper. That line was blank. Closing her eyes, she saw her dad's hand in hers, heard his voice ask for this one last thing. She'd given her word. In 3 weeks, she'd check that box or break herself trying. The next morning in the classroom brought the full weight of her fight. Hessler stood at the front, explaining ballistics while his eyes kept finding her. When he asked about wind drift at 600 meters, she nailed the answer, using the formula her father had taught her before she could even do the math. Hessler said she was wrong and moved on. When she answered a question on reading Mirage, he cut her off to call on someone else. Corporal Cody Vance gave a weaker answer, but earned a nod. The game was obvious. Nothing she did right would count. But Elise had learned patience from a man who'd sit 19 hours in the freezing cold for 1 shot. She'd learned silence from a father who communicated more with a look than a lecture. And she'd learned you only give doubters power if you let them rent space in your head. Gunnery Sergeant Hessler was set on breaking her. He had no clue what he was up against. The classroom charade went on for 3 more days. Hessler would teach, Elise would know, and he'd find a way to shut her down. The other aspirants watched, some entertained, most just glad they weren't the target. On the 4th day, the routine broke. A different instructor walked in before Hessler. He was older, in his mid-30s, with the easy confidence of a man who had been there and done that. His uniform carried the insignia of a MARSOC raider. His eyes swept the room with the practice scan of a man who learned to read people where a misread was fatal. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, he stated, I'm assisting with your marksmanship eval. He gave Elise no more attention than any other candidate. He didn't single her out or treat her like an issue to be handled. Being just another shooter was a minor thing, but after 4 days under Hessler, it felt like your first breath after nearly drowning. Webb began breaking down the fundamentals of precision fire, and his style was nothing like Hessler's. Where Hessler barked orders, Webb held a discussion. Where Hessler shut down questions, Webb explored them. His voice carried the authority of experience, not the bite of judgment. Mid-session, he described a target at 800 meters with a quartering crosswind and asked for holdover solutions. Elise spoke up before she could second-guess it. The words were clean and exact, a calculation her father had drilled into her skull. She included variables that most shooters would overlook, like how temperature affects powder burn rate and how shifting crosswinds at altitude create complex drift. When she finished, Webb just nodded. That's a good copy, he said. He held her gaze a second too long, as if filing away a key piece of intel. Hessler arrived late, standing at the back with his arms crossed and jaw tight, watching Webb with a possessive glare. When the class wrapped, he caught Elise at the door. Putting on a show for the new guy, he said under his breath, sucking up. She didn't bite. He leaned in, his voice dropping. It won't help. Webb doesn't grade the final qual, I do. She held his stare for 2 seconds flat, then moved past him without a word. It was a small win, but in a war of attrition, you take what you can get. That evening, after formation, Elise was alone on the path behind the barracks. The Georgia heat had finally backed off. She was running wind formulas in her head when boots crunched on the gravel behind her. Staff Sergeant Thorne. She turned. Marcus Webb stood a respectful ways off, his stance casual but his focus sharp. "Sergeant First Class," she said. He motioned to the woods. "Walk with me." They moved away from the barracks, toward a place where words wouldn't carry. Webb stayed silent for a moment, and Elise knew that kind of quiet. He was weighing his words, picking them with the same care he'd use for a target. "Your answer today," he finally said, "the wind calculation. You brought up variables not in the training manual." It was a statement, but the question was clear. "My father taught me," she answered. "He spent 40 years hunting in Montana. Up in those mountains, wind shifts every 100 meters of elevation. You learn to read what the books don't cover, or you come back with nothing." Webb nodded slowly. "Thomas Thorne." This time, it wasn't a question. Elise stopped walking. "You knew him?" "The name, not the man." Webb turned to face her. "Montana shooting circles talk about him like he was some kind of ghost. A guy who could make shots that broke the laws of physics. They say he taught his daughter everything." He paused, his eyes locked on hers. "They also say she might just be better." Something tightened in Elise's chest. Her father was a legend in those mountains, his name spoken with respect in gun shops across 3 states. Being measured against him was both an honor and a crushing weight. "I'm trying to be," she said, her voice low. Webb was quiet for a beat. Then he spoke deliberately. "Look, Staff Sergeant, I need you to understand. I can't shield you from Hessler. The regs give him total authority on evals. But what I can do is make damn sure your performance is recorded accurately." He met her eyes. "If you shoot half as good as your father's legend, the paper trail will say it all." It wasn't a promise of help. It was a promise of fairness, and in a system rigged against her, that might be the only weapon she had. "Thank you, Sergeant First Class." Webb shook his head. "Don't thank me. Hessler's gonna come after you even harder now. You threaten his whole belief system about women in combat." He started back toward the barracks. "There's something else," he said over his shoulder. Hessler had a sister, Caroline. She went for Ranger School back in 2011. Top of her class, insane PT scores, a perfect candidate on paper. Webb stopped and turned. She made it through the first 2 phases. Then she snapped. A complete psychological break. Started seeing things. Totally disconnected from reality. Medical discharge. Psych hold. The whole nightmare. A cold realization settled in Elise's gut. "He thinks I'm gonna break like she did." "No," Webb said. "Hessler is terrified you're gonna break like she did. That's why he's pushing so hard to get you out. In his screwed up head, he thinks he's protecting you." He walked away, leaving her with the Georgia night and a new understanding of the man trying to destroy her. Hessler wasn't just a bigot. He was a brother, haunted by a ghost he couldn't save. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness, but it fueled her determination to prove him dead wrong. The news came during the last formation of the day. "Tomorrow," Hessler's voice cut through the evening air, "you'll face your first live fire assessment. Known distance targets from 100 to 600 meters. Marksmanship fundamentals. The baseline that decides who moves on and who goes home." His eyes found Elise in the ranks. "I expect some of you will find this assessment a challenge. For some, it will be the moment you accept you're out of your league." He smiled, a cold, empty gesture. "I look forward to seeing who stands and who falls." That night, Elise stripped and cleaned her rifle 3 times. She confirmed her scope's alignment twice, then checked it again. She ran wind calculations in her mind until the numbers became a blur behind her eyes. Finally, in her bunk, she pulled out her dad's old photograph one last time. He stared back from a Montana meadow, frozen in a moment of pure competence, the quiet confidence of a master. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the photo, "tomorrow I show them everything you taught me." She remembered the valleys where he'd spent hours teaching her to read the wind by the movement of grass and the shimmer of a mirage. She thought of the day she was 15 and nailed a shot at 900 meters that her dad called the best he'd ever seen. It was their last hunt before she enlisted. Now, 12 years later, she would use every single lesson to survive a test designed to make her fail. Elise flipped the picture over, looking at the third unchecked line. Become Army Sniper. Soon, she promised. Soon, Dad. The range at Harmony Church was a pale, flat expanse under the morning sky. Targets were set at known distances from 100 to 600 meters. 24 candidates took their places in their assigned lanes. Rifles were checked and rechecked. Nerves vibrated just beneath a surface of military calm. Elise drew lane 17. Hessler placed himself directly behind her. She got into her prone position, her cheek welded to the stock. Through her scope, the 100-meter target was crisp. The black silhouette was a stark shape against the Georgia clay. Instantly, something felt wrong. The reticle was off. Just a fraction, a hair's breadth that most wouldn't notice. But she'd been behind a scope since she was 9. She knew a zeroed weapon by feel. Someone had messed with her elevation turret. She didn't move, didn't look back, didn't give Hessler the satisfaction. She ran the math in her head. If the scope's off this much at 100 meters, it'll be exponentially worse at range. She'd have to compensate for every single shot by hand. Hold low when the scope was telling her to hold center. Trust her instinct over her equipment. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, so clear it was like he was right there. Asterisk. The rifle is a tool, Elise. You are the weapon. Asterisk. She fired. The round hit center mass. She adjusted by feel, not by her optics. Fired again. Center mass. 5 rounds, 5 hits. A group tight enough to be covered by a quarter. Behind her, she could feel Hessler's confusion radiating off him like heat. At 200 meters, she compensated again. The mental math got harder. The margin for error became non-existent. She sent a round, adjusting from the dirt puff, not the crosshairs. Fired again. Her grouping loosened but stayed well inside the line for qualification. 300 meters, 400. Each range demanded fresh dope for the sabotaged glass. Sweat traced her spine, less from the Georgia heat than the pure focus needed to shoot a compromised weapon this true. At 500 meters, her cluster opened more than she liked. Still a pass, but a hell of a lot less than what she could do. 600 meters felt like a final exam she hadn't crammed for. This was the shot that separated trigger pullers from hunters of men. Elise steadied her breath, running the numbers one last time. The scope was feeding her a lie, off by nearly a full minute of angle. She'd have to hold almost 6 inches low to put the round on steel. She fired. The impact blossomed on the target's chest, just left of the heart. A hit, but sloppy. She adjusted on gut instinct, ignoring the lying reticle, and sent another, closer to the X. Her last 3 rounds punched a ragged hole inches apart, a group that would have been a damn miracle even with a properly zeroed rifle. When the scores came in, Elise had qualified, not top of the class, but solidly in the upper third. Webb read the results with the same flat tone he used for everything. Hlur stood next to him, his expression a twitching mess of disbelief and raw fury. Once the range was cold, Elise took her rifle to the armory. She carefully detached the scope, checked the turrets, and saw exactly what she'd figured. The elevation knob was 3 clicks off her zero. Somebody had been at her weapon between last night's cleaning and this morning's qual. She stared at the dial for a long beat, a cold weight settling in her gut. This wasn't going to end. Hlur would keep at it, keep undermining her, trying to wash her out. Fine. If he wanted a war of inches, she'd give him one. Elise reattached the optic, dialed in her true zero, and snapped pictures of the settings with her phone. Next time he pulled this crap, she'd have proof. She was securing the rifle when Webb materialized beside her. "Your scope was off," he stated, his voice low. It wasn't a question. Elise just nodded. "Can you prove it was tampered with?" "No, Gunny. Then my hands are tied, officially." Webb paused. "But I'll tell you this. What you pulled today, qualifying with gear somebody deliberately jacked up, most Marines couldn't do that." He locked eyes with her. "And I'll tell you something else. It's only gonna get uglier. Elise gave a short nod. She knew. Webb turned to leave, then stopped. Your old man would be proud of you, Staff Sergeant. The words landed like a gut punch. Alone in the armory, surrounded by the scent of CLP and steel, she let herself feel the loss for 1 second. Then she boxed it up, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the Georgia humidity. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to survive Haler's games, earn her place, and make the shot her father asked her to take, the impossible shot. Target 17. Elise hadn't breathed a word of it, but her mind was made up the second she heard of it. That target, the one no one had hit in 40 years of this course, was going to be hers. Not for Ayler, or Webb, or the 23 other shooters watching her, but because somewhere under the Montana dirt, Thomas Thorne was watching, too. And she'd made a promise. The stalking phase kicked off on a Monday morning. With fog clinging to the pines like leftover smoke, Huller briefed the candidates at the edge of a training area that stretched for miles across brutal terrain. This is where shooters get washed out, Huller barked, his gaze landing on Elise. This is where we see who can hunt and who can just shoot. Marksmanship got you here. Fieldcraft is what will keep you alive. He gave a smile that was all ice. Out there, things happen. Dehydration, busted ankles, Marines who get broke off. The threat hung in the thick air. I expect we'll be losing a few of you this week. The exercise was simple on paper and a bastard in practice. Each shooter had to low crawl 800 meters of rough country toward an OP manned by instructors with powerful optics. The objective was to reach a final firing point, spot a target, and make the shot without being seen. Get spotted, you fail. Fail, and you start over. 3 failures and you were out of the course for good. Elise drew her lane assignment and felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Sector 9. She'd heard the others whispering about Sector 9 after taps. The northwest quadrant, the nastiest ground on the range, with rocks that chewed up gear and minimal cover. It was the lane instructors saved for candidates they wanted to break. She started her stalk at 0700. The first 200 meters were a shallow, brush-filled ravine. She moved like her father taught her, an inch at a time, testing the ground, becoming a piece of the landscape. The memory surfaced on its own. She was 12, lying in a Montana field next to her dad, a mule deer grazing 100 yards out. His hand was on her back, calming her breathing, his voice a wisp of sound. That buck knows you're here, Elise. He can feel you. But if you become the grass, become the dirt, become nothing but quiet patience, he'll write you off. He'll decide you're no threat. And that's when you get your shot. She had laid there for 2 hours without a twitch, muscles screaming, just wanting to move, to do anything but be still. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the buck never even knew. That night, her father said she was a natural, born with a gift hunter's chase for a lifetime. She hadn't really gotten it then. She got it now. The middle part of her stalk was a grinder. The rocky earth tore at her knees and elbows. Drawing blood, she ignored. The sun climbed, and the heat became a physical weight on her back. Sweat soaked her camis, dried, and soaked them again. She passed another candidate, motionless, his face pale from heat exhaustion. Helping him would mean exposing herself. She pushed on. By early afternoon, she was at the final approach. 50 meters of knee-high grass was all that separated her from the firing line. The OP was dead ahead. Instructors were glassing the field, looking for any twitch, any unnatural shape. She could see Haler up there, his binos sweeping back and forth like a predator's. Elise melted into the ground, smelling the earth, feeling the grass on her face. An ant crawled over her hand. She didn't flinch. She began to move with the wind. Every movement matched the sway of the grass, her ghillie suit making her just another part of the field. When the breeze died, she froze. When it moved, she moved with it. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the world. It took her 90 minutes to cover those 50 meters. Once in position, she found her target, milled the distance by eye instead of laser, and gently pressed the trigger. The shot was perfect, center mass at 420 meters. Her range call off by less than 10. She'd completed the stalk completely unseen. An hour later, she stood before Haler as he went over her scorecard. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes were burning. Staff Sergeant Thorne, he said, drawing out the words. Your shot was on the money. Your approach was clean. He paused, and Elise felt the trap being set. However, during your final 50 meters, I observed your left elbow break the grass line on 3 occasions. In a real-world scenario, that constitutes being compromised. The words felt like a punch. I wasn't flagged by any observer, Master Sergeant. I'm an observer, Hlur countered, his voice slick, and I'm flagging you. He made a mark on his clipboard like he was hammering a nail in a coffin. This stalk is a no-go. You'll run it again tomorrow. Elise stood locked at attention, her mind flipping through course regulations, trying to find a loophole to challenge him. She opened her mouth to argue, to fight the blatant screwjob. But before she could speak, another voice cut in. Master Sergeant Haler. Marcus Webb walked up, clipboard in hand, his pace calm but deliberate. I was watching Staff Sergeant Thorne's approach from the secondary observation post. I never saw him break the wood line. He moved next to Elise, placing himself almost between her and Hessler, a clear statement of his position. I've logged my observation. Webb presented a form, its fields filled with meticulous script. Hessler's face hardened. Gunnery Sergeant Webb. This trainee is in my evaluation block, and the course SOP dictates a senior instructor must resolve any disputed call, Webb stated. His tone was flat, professional, but laced with iron. I'm ready to take this to the CO if required. The tension between them was a tangible thing. Elise saw Hessler running the calculations, saw the rage kindle in his eyes as he grasped he'd been boxed in before the very trainee he aimed to crush. Fine, Hessler bit out. The word like a gunshot. The stalk is a go. He faced Elise, his voice dropping to a low murmur for her alone. Congratulations, Staff Sergeant. You made it through today. Webb gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod and moved off. Hessler tracked his departure before his eyes locked back on her. His voice was quiet now, an invasive intimacy that made her skin prickle. You think you won something? He asked. You think Webb watching your 6 changes a damn thing? He leaned in, and she caught the scent of stale coffee and something acidic underneath it. Desperation, maybe, or pure rage. The Fex is next. 3 days out in the sticks. No observers to bail you out, no regs to hide behind, just you, the terrain, and 1,000 ways for things to go sideways. His smile was a cold, ugly thing. I've seen Marines like you before, Staff Sergeant. Marines who think talent is a pass, who think they're special. He gave a slow shake of his head. The field breaks, every last one of them. He walked off, leaving Elise alone on the range, the Georgia sun beating on her neck, and the future pressing down on her like a burial stone. That night, she field-stripped her rifle behind the barracks, her hands moving with rote precision as her mind ran the grim calculus of survival. 3 days in Sector 9. 72 hours for Hessler to find any fault, any weakness to exploit. The crunch of boots on gravel broke the quiet. Staff Sergeant. She looked up. A young Marine stood at a careful distance, all sandy hair and lean, nervous energy he hadn't yet learned to mask. PFC Garrett Caldwell, he stated. We're in the same squad bay. Elise gave a slight nod. She'd clocked him before the boot, who always tried too hard in PT, who couldn't stay quiet to save his life. What do you need, Private? Caldwell shifted his feet, looking ill at ease. I saw what went down on the range today with Gunny Hessler. He hesitated, then the words spilled out. I'm gonna wash out, Staff Sergeant. My stalk lane is tomorrow. And I can't do it. I can't be quiet. Back in the hollers where I'm from, you make noise in the woods. You let the bears and cats know you're there. Being silent gets you hunted. He looked at her, his eyes full of desperation. But out here, silent is all that matters, and I don't know how. Elise sized him up. Caldwell was maybe 22, with working man's hands and an accent that put him deep in Appalachia. First in his family to wear the uniform, she figured. Coal miner stock, the kind of kid who enlisted as the only escape from a dying town. Where are you from, Private? Eastern Kentucky, Harlan County. Elise nodded. She got it now. In those mountains, noise was survival. You announced your presence. Silence meant a man was hurt, or worse. To make him a scout sniper, She'd have to teach him to unlearn every instinct that had kept him alive for 22 years. I can't give you any official remedial, she said. If Hessler found us training, he'd have both our hides. Caldwell's face fell. But, she added, if you were practicing your stalk behind the training area after lights out, and I just happened to walk by and offer a few pointers, that's just one Marine helping another. A flicker of light in his eyes. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Don't thank me yet. Be behind the range office at 2100. Bring your ghillie. After he left, Elise was alone with her rifle and her thoughts. She knew the risk. Hessler was hunting for any excuse to nail her for fraternization, anything to get her dropped. But her father's words echoed in her mind. A true rifleman always protects his own, Elise. That's what separates a shooter from a sniper. A shooter just ends lives. A sniper saves them. It could mean squeezing a trigger, or it could mean teaching a boot how to stay alive. She'd made a promise to her father. A promise to be the kind of Marine he raised her to be, even if it meant putting her whole career on the line. At 2100 sharp, she found Caldwell in the shadows behind the range office. For 2 hours, she broke down the art of unseen movement, how to read the ground for cover, how to use shadow and negative space to vanish, how to think like the hunted, not the hunter. The kid was a sponge, soaking it all up with the intensity of a drowning man. By the time true dark had set in, he'd already shifted his hide 3 times, each position better than the last. They were discussing his observation lanes when a beam cut through the dark. Hessler emerged from the blackness, his light pinning them both, tracing the damning image of a male and female Marine, alone in the woods at night. Well, he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, look what we have here. Elise was on her feet instantly, back straight. Gunnery sergeant. I was providing some peer-to-peer instruction on observation. Peer instruction? Hessler savored the words. At 2200, in a hide, with a male trainee. He shook his head slowly, that cold smile spreading. That's not what this looks like, Staff Sergeant. Caldwell started to talk, but Hessler silenced him with a hand gesture. PFC Caldwell, get your ass back to the barracks. Now, you and I will have a chat tomorrow. He waited for the private to vanish, then turned back to Elise. Fraternization, he said, flipping open a notepad. It's against MCOP 1326.2. Grounds for an immediate drop from the course. He moved closer. I needed something solid, Staff Sergeant. Something not even Gunny Webb can talk his way out of for you. Something on paper, his pen scratched. I think I finally found it. Elise held her voice even. Nothing improper happened, Gunnery Sergeant. I was helping a fellow Marine with his fieldcraft. Marine Corps Order 1500.61 specifically authorizes peer training, an MCO that assumes the training is professional. Hessler countered. 2200 hours, an isolated spot, a pattern of contact. He snapped the notebook shut. I'm submitting this for formal review. In the meantime, you're on lockdown outside of scheduled training. He started to walk away, then paused. The FEX kicks off in 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. I'd use that time to think about your future, because as of right now, it's in my hands. He melted into the night, leaving Elise with the insects and the crushing weight of her career collapsing around her. She walked to the barracks on autopilot, her mind cycling through the inevitable outcomes. Hessler would push the charge. Webb might go to bat for her, but a reg is a reg. Even the suggestion of impropriety was a career killer, never mind her sniper qualification. 8 months back, she'd made a promise to a dying man. Now that promise was sand slipping through her fingers, and she was powerless to stop it. She was on her rack, staring at nothing, when she caught hushed voices from the catwalk outside. 2 men, their tones low and urgent. She recognized them instantly. Hessler and Cody Vance. Elise knew she should move. Ear-hustling instructors was a faster way to get dropped than fraternization. But a raw, broken edge in Hessler's voice stopped her cold. It was a sound she'd never heard from him. She slid to the window, staying deep in the shadows, and listened. You don't get it, Hessler was saying. You think this is about standards? About the integrity of this course? It's not. It was never about that. Vance's reply was barely a whisper. My sister, she wanted to be a ranger, Hatcher said, his tone heavy with a sorrow that felt ancient. 15 years back, Caroline, she was a powerhouse, strong, quick, sharp, aced boot camp. The brass all said she was the real deal. He took a shaky breath, blew through the first two phases. The whole family, the whole damn corps had their eyes on her. My old man said she was going to make history. First Hatcher in 3 generations to earn that tab. The silence hung heavy in the air. And then she snapped. Hatcher murmured, "Week 5. Just cratered. Couldn't move another inch." They found her in her rack at 0300, talking to ghosts. A total psych break, the doc said. Dissociation. Vance's voice, when it came, was different. Softer. "What happened to her?" Hatcher replied, "Medical discharge. 6 months in a VA psych ward." Hatcher's voice was dead flat, the way men sound when they talk about a hurt too deep to carry emotion. She wasn't the same person when she came out. Lives in some group home down in Alabama. Can't hold a job, can't keep a friend. My father won't even say her name. The quiet stretched on. He says she brought shame on the family, on him. Thorne heard the scuff of boots on the floor. Every time I see a woman come through this course thinking she can hack it, I see Caroline, Hatcher admitted. I see what this place did to her, what the pressure cooked up inside her head. His voice fell to a broken whisper. This ain't about being cruel, Vance. It's about stopping it from happening again. It's about saving them from what they think they want. Vance muttered something Thorne couldn't make out. Then Hatcher's voice regained its familiar, iron edge. "Thorne is different. I'm not blind. She's got something most of these grunts will never have. But that's exactly what makes her a liability. The more squared away they are, the harder they drive themselves. And the harder the drive, the uglier the wreck." He paused. "I'm gonna give her every off-ramp, every chance to walk away before this place guts her. If she's got any sense, she'll take one." Thorne backed away from the window, her pulse hammering in her ears. Hatcher wasn't just some pig-headed gunny. He was a man haunted by ghosts, trying to fight a war that was already lost. His campaign against her wasn't about her at all. It was about Caroline. And 15 years of watching his sister drift in a fog. It was about the crushing guilt of not being able to save her. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness. It didn't erase the gear inspections, the bogus write-ups, or the relentless push to make her quit. But it explained the chilling depth of his animosity, and it forged her resolve into something harder than steel. She would do this not just for herself, but for the woman who had broken under a weight Thorne was now determined to bear. The word came down at morning formation. "The final Field X kicks off at 0500 tomorrow," Hatcher announced, his voice like gravel. 72 hours in your assigned sectors. Stalks, observation posts, and unknown distance targets. Scoring is based on stealth, precision, and mission accomplishment." His gaze locked onto Thorne. "Anything under 70% is a wash." He let that hang in the air. "Sergeant Thorne, you're assigned to Sector 9. A low ripple went through the ranks. Everyone knew Sector 9, the place where nobody ever broke 85%. It was the sector Hatcher used to break the ones he wanted gone. Across the formation, Caldwell shot her a look of raw concern. Thorne kept her expression a mask of stone, her back ramrod straight. She expected no less. That night, she studied a topo map borrowed from the range office, the barracks silent around her. Sector 9 was a nightmare of contour lines, a landscape of pure punishment. It showed unforgiving ridges, impenetrable thickets, and OP positions designed for maximum failure. 72 hours in hell. But Thorne was raised in mountains that made Georgia look like a park. Her father had taught her to shoot an azimuth off the stars when a compass was useless, to find water where the maps showed dry earth, to endure where most Marines would fold before the second day. Hatcher thought Sector 9 was his ace in the hole. He had no clue who he was dealing with. She pulled out the worn photograph of her father. Thomas Thorne stared back, frozen in time in a Montana field, his rifle in hand, a confident smile on his face. 3 more days, she whispered to him. 3 days, then qualification. Then I take the shot no one else can make. She flipped the photo, tracing the third, unfinished line. Asterisk, become a Marine Scout sniper. Asterisk, Almost there, Dad, she said softly. The exercise began in the pre-dawn gloom, candidates melting into their sectors like phantoms. Thorne humped her pack into Sector 9, guided by her rifle, her training, and her father's ghost. From the command post, Hatcher tracked her on the monitor until she vanished into the woods. He had thrown his worst terrain, his most brutal test, at her. Now he'd see if Thomas Thorne's daughter could survive it. 72 hours in Sector 9 was a slow-motion beatdown. The ground was worse than the map, meaner than the stories. Rocky inclines chewed her knees and elbows raw. The brush was so dense she had to low crawl for what felt like miles, her pack snagging, thorns tearing at her camis. Instructors manned OPs on every high point, their eyes seeming to anticipate her every move, but Thorne refused to break. The first day was a gut check of endurance under a sun that baked the woods into an oven. She flowed through it, finding paths of least resistance, saving energy, and working with the terrain. Sweat soaked her uniform, dried, then soaked it again. The bugs were relentless. The pack straps gnawed at her shoulders until the pain was just static. By afternoon, she reached her first target, an unknown distant silhouette in a clearing 400 meters below her ridge. No rangefinder, no spotter. Just her eyes, her gut, and the lessons her father had hammered into her. She read the subtle shifts in vegetation, the size of the target against the trees, the faint shimmer of the air. She called it 420 meters. She accounted for the steep downward angle, doped a slight crosswind, and squeezed the trigger. The round hit 2 inches left of center, a solid hit. She marked her grid and pushed on. Day 2 was all about observation. Long hours frozen in a hide, sketching the activity of a mock enemy camp while instructors hunted for her. The stillness was its own form of agony. Muscles screamed, and the mind threatened to drift. Thorne slipped into what her father called the quiet place, a state of pure awareness where nothing and everything demanded focus. She watched, she sketched, she remained a ghost. On the morning of the 3rd day, she saw the tripwire, stretched taut at ankle height across a trail, perfectly hidden in the morning shadows. It was a training device, sure, but it was also a test. A trap set for one specific Marine Hatcher wanted to see fail. Thorne halted 3 inches from it. She saw the wire, followed it to the trees, and understood the message completely. It was a final, personal challenge. She carefully disarmed it, snapped a photo with her phone as evidence, and moved on. The final test was on day 3, a stalk along Sector 9's notorious Razorback Ridge, 400 meters of exposed rock leading to a final firing position. It was the approach that had washed out every candidate assigned to this sector for the last 3 years. Thorne started at 0600 and didn't reach the firing position until 1400. 8 hours to crawl 400 meters. She moved with the shifting shadows and the sighing wind. She became another rock on that unforgiving Georgia ridge. When she finally settled in, she found her target, ranging it at 680 meters. Her grip was rock solid, her breathing a controlled whisper. She squeezed the trigger, sending the round downrange. That night, the scores went up. Her name was lit at the top for range 9, 91%, the highest mark in the 40-year history of the schoolhouse. Gunny Miller stared at the board, the numbers looking like some foreign script he couldn't decipher. The dope book in his hands shook just enough to notice. As Thorne came to check her score, he turned. 91%, he muttered. On range 9. His tone wasn't congratulatory, it was hollow, disbelieving. My old man taught me the ground isn't the real enemy, Gunny, Thorne said, her voice just as low. Fear is. Her eyes locked on his. Your sister wasn't weak, Gunnery Sergeant. The machine that chewed her up was broken. But I'm not her, and you won't save me by breaking me too. She spun on her heel, leaving him alone with his clip chart and his ghost. The final qualification day broke blistering and clear. The remaining Marines formed up on Toddfield Range for the last test. Of the 24 who'd started 3 weeks prior, only 18 were left standing. 6 had attrited during the stalk, beaten by the terrain, the heat, or the crushing weight of constant evaluation. Thorne stood in formation, feeling the gravity of why she was there. Her father's death, the promise she'd made at his funeral, and 3 weeks of sabotage meant to wash her out. It all came down to this day. The known distance range was first, with targets from 200 to 800 meters out. This was the gut check, what separated a grunt with a rifle from a true marksman. Thorne moved through the course of fire with the precision of a machine. Her breathing was a steady rhythm, her trigger pressed clean. Her groupings were so tight that the spotter, Webb, just scrawled one word on his evaluation: exceptional. She posted a 98%, second only to a 31-year-old sergeant named Jameson Kowalski, a quiet professional with surgeon's hands and a deliberate way of doing things. The unknown distance range followed, targets scattered across broken ground at unannounced ranges. This was where gut instinct trumped training, where a shooter's eye made all the difference. The first silhouette popped at what Thorne guesstimated to be 340 meters. She called her range, dialed her dope, and fired. A solid center mass hit. The next target appeared at 580 meters. She read the mirage, factored the elevation, and squeezed. Another hit. By the end of the UKD course, she hadn't missed a call by more than 10 meters. Her shots landed with a consistency that had the other candidates just stopping to watch her work. The final stalk was last. A long crawl through alien terrain toward an observation post actively hunting for her. Thorne melted into the brush, only reappearing when she was set. Her crosshairs were steady on the observer's chest. They never knew she was there until she announced it with a perfect shot. When the final scores were posted, her name was on top, highest marks in the class. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne was officially a Marine Corps Scout sniper. But the day wasn't over. Webb marched the newly qualified snipers to the end of Toddfield, to a valley that held a legend most had only heard about in rumors. Target 17. The steel plate was a ghost, barely visible through a narrow slot between two pines. A dark blur shimmering in the heat almost 3/4 of a mile away. "This is voluntary," Webb announced, his voice cutting through the quiet. "No one has to take this shot. It has no bearing on your qualification." He let that hang in the air, his face betraying that he knew what this meant. "But for any of you who want to try, this is your shot." Cody Vance swaggered up first. He'd qualified, but just barely, an unremarkable performance. He proned out with the confidence of a man who thought he was about to make history. He made a whole ceremony of it, checking his scope, reading the wind flags, putting on a show. When he finally fired, the round impacted 50 meters left, lost in the trees. His second shot went even wider. A third sailed clean over the target into the berm behind it. Vance got up, his jaw clenched. "Wind's squirrely," he muttered to the air. "Can't read it." He stomped off, refusing to look at anyone, his hands balled into tight fists. Jameson Kowalski went next. His approach was clinical, patient. He spent long minutes just watching, reading the sway of the grass, noting every flutter of the flags like a scientist. When he sent his round, it kicked up dirt just behind the steel. A near thing. Closer than most had ever gotten, but still a miss. He stood, gave a single, accepting nod, and stepped away with the quiet grace of a man who knew his limits. "Good try," Webb said. Kowalski just nodded back, his face a mask. 3 more tried, 3 more failed. The valley seemed to drink their bullets. For 40 years, Target 17 had stood untouched. 847 documented attempts, 0 confirmed hits. Then, Garrett Caldwell took his turn. He'd barely squeaked by, his stalking scores just enough to pull him over the line. He looked at that sliver of steel like a man with absolutely nothing to lose. He fired. The round hit low, throwing up dust 20 meters short. He adjusted and fired again. Closer, but still short. His third round slapped the dirt right under the plate. A miss, but a damn fine one. He stood, caught Thorne's eye, and gave a slight nod. "Your shot," that look said. Everyone else had either tried or passed. Only Thorne was left. Gunny Miller stepped forward before she could move, planting himself where everyone could hear him. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he called out, and her name sounded like an accusation. "The woman who thinks she can outshoot 40 years of men?" He waved a hand toward the valley. 1,247 meters, through shifting thermals and a crosswind you can't predict, down a firing lane no wider than your own shoulders. He gave a cold, thin smile. "Nobody makes that shot." The words hung heavy in the humid air. Every Marine was watching. Kowalski stood with his arms folded. Caldwell's face was etched with tension. Even Vance had come back, his face a mix of envy and morbid curiosity. Webb stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. And far away, on a high ridge, Colonel Patricia Drummond watched it all unfold through a spotting scope. Thorne walked to the firing line and settled into the dirt. The prone position felt right, steady, like coming home. She found the target in her scope, the steel silhouette wavering in the mirage. The wind flags down the valley were liars, each one telling a different story, pointing in 3 different directions at once. The slot between the trees looked impossibly small. She ignored it all. She watched the grass instead. At 200 meters, it bent left. At 400, it swirled, indicating a thermal updraft. At 600, it whipped violently. At 800, the pattern shifted again. She built a mental map of the air currents flowing down that valley, layer by invisible layer. She could feel its rhythm, the pulse of heat rising off the rocks, the brief, dead calm between gusts that lasted only a fraction of a second. Her father's voice echoed in her head, as real as if he were lying right there next to her. The rifle's a tool, Elise. You're the weapon. The bullet is just lead. You're the guidance. The scope tells you what the book says. Your gut tells you the truth. Trust the one that comes from a lifetime of watching wind snake through mountain passes. She dialed her dope. 12 minutes of angle up, 4 minutes of angle left for wind. It was a hold that defied every chart, every formula she'd ever memorized. A hold no instructor would ever teach. Behind her, Miller's voice sliced through the silence again. She's gonna miss, he announced, making sure every last Marine could hear him. Same as all the rest. Thorne let out a slow, measured breath. Her fingers settled on the trigger. The entire world shrank to one single point of focus. Just steel and wind, suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She squeezed. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder. The crack of the shot thundered across the valley, echoing off the distant hills. The round exited the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, starting its long flight toward a target no one had hit in 40 years. Thorne stayed in the scope, watching the bullet's faint trace cut through the shimmering air, seeing it drop and drift on a path she had willed into existence. 1 second. The round crossed the halfway mark, flying true. 1.5 seconds. The round cut through the pines, a ghost in the narrow corridor with just inches of clearance. Then the report hit her, a clean, sharp, times ping, times of steel on steel. That sound, the music of a perfect shot, echoed up the valley, a declaration of the impossible made real. For a beat, the entire firing line went dead still. Then, Lance Corporal Caldwell let out a raw, guttural whoop that tore the silence apart. He slammed a fist into the air, yelling something that was half praise, half pure adrenaline. Kowalski started clapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm that quickly became a storm of applause. Another shooter joined in. In moments, the whole line was on their feet, their faces a mix of disbelief and hardcore respect. Elise pushed herself up from the dirt, facing the valley. Her hands were rock steady, her breathing even. Deep inside, a knot that had been strangling her for 3 straight weeks finally gave way. She'd done it. The shot no one could make, the target that had washed out hopefuls for 40 years. She'd sent a round through an 8-foot gap at over 1,200 yards and hit steel, cold bore. Gunny Webb approached, a look of near reverence in his eyes. He offered his hand, and she took it. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice low. "That was the single finest piece of marksmanship I've seen in 20 years in the Corps." He held her grip. "Your old man would be proud." Elise just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She saw the photo in her mind, the man in a Montana field teaching a girl to read the wind lessons that had just echoed louder than any doubt. The crowd of Marines parted, making way for a figure striding from the observation tower. Colonel Patricia Drummond moved with the sharp economy of a lifer, the silver eagles on her collar flashing in the sun. She was in her 50s, with steel gray hair in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. She stopped before Elise, her gaze analytical, Staff Sergeant Thorne, the colonel stated. I was observing from the command post. She glanced toward the valley where Target 17 stood, now marked with a fresh scar. I'm told you just did something no one in the history of this school has ever accomplished. Yes, ma'am. Elise's reply was steady. Drummond gave a slow nod. I went through your service record book before you arrived. Top rifle scores in your battalion. 2 combat tours. A string of outstanding fitness reports. She paused. I also saw the write-ups from this course. The friction, the disputes, the resistance you got from certain instructors. Elise remained silent. There was nothing to add. Know this, Drummond continued. I'll be conducting a personal review of this course's command climate. But right now, one question. She gestured to the distant target. How in the hell did you make a shot that has defeated everyone else? Elise could have listed the technical data, the Coriolis effect, spindrift, mirage readings, but that wasn't the truth. My father used to say, impossible is just a word for something that hasn't been done yet, she said. He taught me to shoot in draws like this, to feel the wind, not just calculate it. She looked out at Target 17. He passed away 8 months ago, before I could show him I'd learned anything. Before I could prove his lessons meant something. A hard knot formed in her throat. I came here to prove they meant everything. For a long moment, Drummond said nothing. Then she nodded, her expression firm. They were worth everything, Staff Sergeant. She turned to Webb. Gunny, get this documented. I want that shot in the official record. Webb snapped a salute. Ah yeah, Mom. As Drummond departed, another figure emerged. Hessler. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a tight mask of fury. Raw anger burned in his eyes, but underneath it was the unmistakable glint of defeat. He walked toward her, each step heavy and deliberate. The other Marines went quiet, watching the confrontation unfold. He stopped in front of her, the silence stretching out, thick and heavy. He pulled out his damn clipboard, the one he'd used to log every supposed infraction, every fabricated failure. Target 17, he stated, his voice a dead monotone. Staff Sergeant Thorne, first round impact, center mass. He penned the words with a rigid precision, though his hand shook slightly. He ripped the sheet off and shoved it at Webb without looking. He then turned back to Elise. She waited, expecting something, an insult, a grudging word, anything. Instead, he just stared, his eyes a swirling mess of emotions she couldn't decipher. Then, without a word, he turned and stalked away. Caldwell was suddenly at her side, his face beaming. You did it, he choked out, his voice thick. You actually, honest to God, did it. He just shook his head, lost in the moment. Staff Sergeant, I ain't never seen anything like that in my life. Elise watched Hessler's rigid back as he disappeared. The man who had done everything he could to break her. The instructor whose professional pride had been so shattered by her success, he'd been forced to document his own defeat in his own handwriting. It's not over, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Caldwell looked confused. What do you mean? You made the shot. You qualified. What's left? Elise met his gaze. Graduation, she said, and whatever comes next. She knew men like Hessler. They didn't take defeat lying down. The next 24 hours would decide everything. For now, though, she let the feeling wash over her, the hard-earned, undeniable truth. She was going to be a Marine Corps scout sniper, and no one on this earth could ever take that away from her. That night, long after the backslapping was done, Elise was alone on the range. She stood on the firing line that had changed her life. The valley was a canvas of orange and gold under the setting sun. Target 17 was just a speck through the gap in the trees, a shadow on a faraway hill. She took her father's worn photograph from her pocket, holding it in the last light. Wish you could have seen it, Dad, she whispered. Wish you were here. A breeze moved through the valley, touching the grass in different places, creating a language she could read better than any book. Her father gave her that the ability to see the unseen, to understand what others missed. She came here to prove his legacy, to honor his memory, to show that the kid from Montana had become a warrior. She had done all that. But she'd found something else, too. She wasn't just his legacy. She was her own Marine, her own woman. She flipped the photo over, looking at the faded list. Asterisk. Elise's promises. Asterisk. 1. Graduate high school. Check. 2. Earn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. Check. 3. Qualify Hog. She took a pen from her pocket and drew a firm, dark check mark beside the third promise. It was done. She put the photo away and scanned the valley one last time. Tomorrow was graduation, the official ceremony, the badge that would mark her as one of the deadliest shots in the Corps. But tonight, it was just her, the wind, and the echo of a shot that 40 years of institutional memory said was impossible. She had proven them all dead wrong. The ceremony kicked off at 1000 hours under a clear Quantico sky. 18 Marines stood in formation, their dress blues sharp, their faces etched with the quiet pride of survivors. Families and fellow Marines packed the stands, cameras at the ready to see their own become legends. Colonel Drummond approached the podium, her gaze sweeping over the formation, fully aware of the hell these men and women had just endured. Today, she began, her voice carrying across the parade deck, you join an elite brotherhood. The skills learned here will make you a nightmare for our enemies. The discipline you've shown will define your careers. She paused, her eyes locking onto each graduate. But I want to talk about something more than skill and discipline. I want to talk about exceeding the possible. Her eyes found Elise. Every generation of Marines thinks it knows the limits. We draw lines based on past failures. We build walls based on what we believe to be true. She let the words hang in the air, and then someone comes along and shows us our limits were just suggestions, that our walls were made of smoke. She scanned the ranks of newly minted scout snipers. This class had forged something else entirely, a legend that would be told long after the brass was polished and the certs were hung. A single shot that redefined the limits of this entire institution. Her nod was deliberate. That level of lethality isn't about one Marine. It's a reflection on all of you. It sets a new high water mark for every trigger puller who follows. The graduation ceremony ticked by with parade ground precision names barked out, credentials awarded, grips crushed in handshakes. Each Marine marched to the front, secured their qualification, and rejoined the formation a designated hunter of gunmen. When they called Thorne's name, the air itself seemed to crackle. The applause hit like a shockwave, every eye locked on her. She moved forward, her back a steel rod, gaze fixed, knowing this single moment would forge her reputation for years. Hessler stood beside the colonel, a stack of certificates in hand. His expression was a blank slate of military bearing, but Thorne saw the war underneath the strain in his eyes, the iron clamp of his jaw. He'd been ordered to stand here, to present this award to the woman he'd spent 3 weeks trying to wash out. Staff Sergeant Thorne, the colonel announced, his voice booming, graduating top of her class. He paused for effect, and the first candidate in the 40-year history of this school to hit target 17 during qualification, the room erupted. The colonel handed her the main certificate, then motioned for Hessler to present the special commendation for her impossible shot. Hessler took one step forward. Their eyes met and held. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Thorne read it all in his stare, the bitter resentment he'd carry for a long, long time, the stone-cold respect he could no longer fake. And buried deep, a flicker of pure exhaustion, the weariness of a man who'd waged a war he was destined to lose. He passed her the commendation, his knuckles grazing hers. He leaned in, his voice a low rasp meant only for her. Your old man would be proud, he ground out. I couldn't pull Caroline from the fire, but you pulled yourself out. Maybe you stopped me from making that mistake twice. He stepped back, extending his hand. She took it. It wasn't forgiveness, not even close. But it was acknowledgement. And right then, that was everything. Thorne rejoined the formation. The ceremony rolled on. More names, more paper, more thunderous applause. After the final graduate was recognized, the colonel dismissed the ranks, and the room dissolved into a swarm of heartfelt congratulations. Families mobbed their newly pinned snipers. Cameras flashed. The air was thick with cheers. Thorne hung back, observing the joyful chaos. Kowalski was getting his shoulder punched by a man who had to be his dad. Vance was posing stiffly with a woman who was probably his wife. Before Thorne could ghost out, Garrett Caldwell materialized before her, beaming like he'd just hit the jackpot. "Staff Sergeant," he choked out, his voice thick. "I wouldn't be here without you." He reached for a handshake, then thought better of it, pulling her into a quick, clumsy embrace that felt more honest than a salute ever could. "You taught me more than how to stalk," he said, his voice low. "You showed me how to be a Marine who has their brother's six." He pulled away, his eyes wet. "We don't get many snipers from Harlan County, but we got one today. Thanks to you." Thorne felt a knot form in her throat. She gave a single, sharp nod, unable to speak. Caldwell shot her a final, informal salute before vanishing into the crowd. Seconds later, Webb was at her side. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "walk with me." They moved away from the celebration, toward the quiet tree line where they'd stood weeks before. The fraternization beef Webb started cutting right to it. The colonel reviewed the file, tossed it this morning. Hessler's report was deemed baseless. A wave of pure relief washed through Thorne. "There's more," Webb added. "Hessler's been relieved as an instructor. He's getting new orders within the month." He met her gaze directly. "What you did here went beyond ringing steel on Target 17. You changed the definition of what's possible." He turned to leave, then paused. "Every woman who stands on this grinder after you will have a straighter path because of what you did." And with that, he was gone, leaving Thorne with nothing but the Virginia pines and the sheer gravity of her victory. She walked to her truck as the sun bled across the horizon. Tucked in her wallet, a photo of her father now sat beside her new qualification card. 3 promises, written on the back of that picture. All of them now fulfilled, all debts paid. Thorne drove off the Quantico base as the sky faded to black, leaving behind the range where she'd made the impossible a reality. The squad bay that had been her own personal hell, the institution that had tried to grind her down and had failed. Underneath the Montana dirt, Thomas Thorne was at peace. And on the wind whistling through the Virginia hills, his daughter carried his legacy forward. Staff Sergeant Thorne, United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper, the woman who made the shot no one else could. Her chapter here was over, but her war was just beginning.